Hi tribal monitors. Today we're going to talk about how to conduct a stand survey for emery oaks. So when you come out to your plots, I will have marked where the center of the plot needs to be, and we're going to put a T-post in there, and then we're going to record measurements for trees in a circular fixed radius plot. The plot is going to be have a radius of 23.6 feet or 11.28 meters, and that's a standard plot size for the Forest Service. This way, when we're collecting data, we can also hand off those data to our collaborators at EOSFS so that they can write better prescriptions for these emery oak stands. So imagine that we have a post set in place, we have a string attached to it that's the right radius for our plot. We're going to start facing north. We're going to start on the northern side, and we're going to swing that string around, measuring all trees over 3 inches DRC in that plot. And then for emery oaks, we're going to be collecting extra data because that's what we're really interested in. We're interested in how the emery oaks are responding. So the first place I want to start, I'll explain more about how to make a DRC measurement, but first we're going to start with how we identify emery oaks. So I'm standing right in front of an emery oak right here, and one of the main diagnostic characteristics, of course, of emery oaks is this really nice, dark, blocky bark. So emery oaks have really nice, dark, blocky bark, and then they have leaves. You just pluck a branch.
It's mine.
Their leaves are really shiny. This has a little fuzz on it. The fuzz will come off. It has fuzz in the spring often. They're shiny. They're pointed like this. They almost have a holly-like shape. If you're standing back from an emery oak, you can see they have almost these umbrella-like canopies. Now, you're going to see in these stands a lot of Arizona white oaks. And they differ from the emery oaks in a couple of key ways. First of all, the leaves are not nearly so shiny, and they're not quite as pointy around the edges. The bark is also different. So whereas emery oaks have these really dark bark like this, the white oaks have a lighter gray bark. And if you look in your training manual, there are leaves of both species and the pictures of bark for both species, so you can start to kind of compare them. When we first get out to the stands, just check in with people that know the trees pretty well. Soon you'll key in to what makes an emery oak, but when the trees are small, sometimes they can be a little bit hard to distinguish. So when we're doing our stand surveys, we're going to want to measure something called DRC, and that stands for diameter at root collar. So if you look down at the base of our tree here, this tree doesn't have a really well-defined root collar, but sometimes you'll notice at the base of a tree there's a slight bulge where the kind of roots are meeting the edge of the tree, and we're going to want to measure right above that when we're taking a DRC measurement. One of the most challenging things to figure out is what constitutes an individual. Emery oak trees can have multiple trunks, and so you kind of have to do a little bit of investigation when you see something like this, which is these 3 trunks coming out of one area. But if you kind of dig down and look at the base, I'm pretty certain that this is actually one individual. So what we would do in this case is we're going to measure all of the trunks, DRCs, and record them as one individual. So we'll add 1 tree tag to the emery oak tree, and we'll measure each of these DRCs for it. And then there are equations that we can use to get a combined DRC for this particular tree to measure its growth through time. So I'll just kind of demo how to get a DRC and tag a tree. Here we go. So as I said, we think that this is an individual emery oak. So what we do is at a height where it kind of feels comfortable to you, but keeping in mind that these trees can have kind of really unique architectures. you want to kind of place a tag. Your tags will come stamped with different numbers, with an ID number, at about this height. It's a place where it feels comfortable to nail them in, but that's going to allow you to be consistent across a lot of different tree shapes and morphologies. When you nail in your ID tag, you may want to try to leave a little extra room with the nail, so leave a little extra out here. That gives space for the trees to grow. And I've been assured by silviculturists that this does not hurt the trees. So you're going to want to have DRC or DBH tape. DBH stands for diameter at breast height, and some tree species, that's how you measure them. You measure the diameter at basically where it would hit your chest. But for this type of tree, we measure diameter at root collar or DRC. You're going to want to make sure kind of get to know your DBH tape. Some tapes will be in the metric system, which is what we kind of prefer for measurements in science. Other times it'll have the English standard measurements. And the important thing is that you just mark what you're measuring in, so that we know whether we're looking at inches or we're looking at centimeters. It's easy to convert between the two, but we have to know kind of what we're looking at. Then it's important, often these DBH tapes have two sides, and one will be like a standard measuring tape, and others will be, and the other side will be the DBH tape. Because the DRC, what we're getting at is we're getting the diameter of the tree, so if you can imagine a line going straight through the tree, that's what we're measuring there. Whereas when we wrap this around the tree, if we're measuring with the inches side, the standard side, we're just going to be getting the circumference, which is going to be much larger than the DRC. So if you ever get confused and you're like, what side of the tape am I measuring with? Just flip them around. Whatever the smaller measurement is will be the DRC side, which is what you always want to be measuring in. So just be sure not to measure the circumference of the tree. Make sure you're getting the diameter. So you're going to get down, like I said, this one doesn't really have a root collar, but you're going to be wanting to be near the base of the ground, holding the DBH tape straight. And you want to just curl the tape around to measure, to line up the DBH tape right there, straight around the tree, curving, keeping everything flat. And this would be 12, this is measuring in, not metric, in standard, English standard units, so this is 12 inches DRC. And then for this individual, I would continue to measure the DRCs for this trunk and for this trunk as well. So let's talk about the other measurements that we want to make for these trees. We want to get some kind of estimate of height. That's going to be important to understanding how these trees are growing and changing through time. And we're going to want to measure two types of height. We're going to want to measure height to the top, to the very top of the tree, height to the very top of the tree, and then height to the lowest branch on the tree. And the reason we want to measure the height to the lowest branch is because that helps us understand how these trees will respond to fire. So that's particularly important if we would do any prescribed burning in these stands. So with the lower branches here, this is so low, you can see you can probably get a direct measurement with a tape measure just to this lowest stem. So you're going to measure from the ground up to the lowest stem on the tree, which is right over here, the lowest living stem. And then for the height to the top of the tree, we're going to use a rangefinder, a digital rangefinder. And each of these different rangefinders has its own specific directions. But typically what you do is you point the rangefinder at the tree and you take a measurement in 3 different locations, and that device will use the angles and the distance from the tree to calculate the height for you automatically. So it's really pretty easy and straightforward, but you'll just have to read the instruction manual for the model that you have. Okay, so let's talk about how to measure the canopy area. The canopy area is going to be one of the most sensitive response variables to our treatments. So once we remove a lot of the competition, we're going to expect those canopies to really branch out and get much larger. So we want to get a nice measurement for this canopy area. To do that, we're going to measure 2 lengths of that canopy, and then we can use an equation to calculate the canopy area from that. So our first measurement that we're going to want to take, we look up at the canopy and we try to figure out, if we're drawing a line straight through the canopy, what the longest line would be. From my perspective, and there's some subjectivity to this, I think that we would go from right about here all the way back through the tree. So this is helpful to do with 2 people. So Zeta, if you can walk that out, try to maintain your line, your tape measure. You want it to be, keep it straight and keep it about level, so that you don't introduce error. So she's out there at the drip line of the tree, or the very edge of the tree canopy. And then we can just take our measurement there. So I'm getting about 4.4 meters. Now we're going to measure the line that's perpendicular to this line. It may not be the next longest axis of that tree, but we want to measure exactly perpendicular to this line, or as close to perpendicular as we can get. So we're going to kind of trade sides here. And I'm going to have to wind up my tape a little bit. Whoopsie. Again, she'll be at the canopy edge. That I actually think it's a little closer, honey. Come this way. Come towards me. Stand up and come towards me.
No, it's in here.
Well, have someone who can look at the canopy and determine where the edge is, and then you take a second measurement across, perpendicular to your initial line. And there's a really nice diagram in your training manual to show you how to make those measurements. But when it comes time to do the acorn counts, there's a standard and very quick way of doing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 2 people each have binoculars so they can see up in the canopy of the trees a little bit better. And we're going to position them at different spots in the canopy. So for instance, I might say, okay, I'm going to scan this area of the canopy, and I'd have a partner who perhaps was located over there scanning that area of the canopy. Then it's really helpful if you can have a 3rd person with a stopwatch. And basically what we do is we get ready, we have the person hit the go button on the stopwatch, and then we count as many acorns as we can for 15 seconds. So we just use our binoculars and we count as many acorns as possible in that 15-second period. Trying to scan the tree and not hit the same places twice. So I would just look up there and perform my counts. And then in your data sheet, when you go to record that, there are slots for the 2 acorn scans. So say I counted 10 acorns, I would just write it right there. Say my partner counted 12, you would write right there. And there's a way to use that. It's a standardized way of being able to compare acorn production across years. Betty, I just wanted to go over how to fill out these data sheets really quickly. So let's pretend that this was the first emery oak tree that you measured in your plot, and you've given it the ID number 1. In this first ID column here, we're just going to record the number 1. And remember, this tree has 3 stems, so we're going to write the number 1 3 times, because we're going to have 3 different DRC measurements. It's important to note that the only rows that you're going to fill in multiple lines for an individual are going to be for this ID column and for the DRC column. The rest of the information we're taking at a tree level. And the reason we're repeating the ID column number is just so that we don't accidentally record information for another tree in these rows that pertain to this particular individual. And remember that there's an equation to condense this DRC. So eventually this will be one number. So there's a special equation that will take all of these DRCs and give us the overall tree DRC. And then eventually we'll wind up with one line of data for each tree. So as we're working our way through this data sheet, keep in mind the data sheet structure can change a little bit depending on what silviculturist we're working with. So this might change just slightly, but it will have all of these major components. So in this case, the tree status, this means is it living or dead, and this tree is alive. You can use 0 for dead and 1 for alive, or I'll just write an L right now for living. We're going to add the species code here because remember, we're going to be conducting an overall stand survey. So within these plots, we're going to be measuring all emery oaks, no matter of their size. We're going to measure juvenile emery oaks as well as adult emery oaks. And that's because we want to know how this population as a whole is responding to our treatments. And we're really curious in whether we can increase our recruitment of juvenile and emery oaks. So we're going to measure the small trees as well. But for all other trees in the plot, we're just going to measure individuals that are over 3 inches DRC. And we're just going to take a DRC measurement. So it's going to be important to record the species so that we know what other species are at these plots. In this case, we're measuring an emery oak. And the species code is, in general, just the first 2 letters of the genus and the first 2 letters of the species name. So the genus and species for emery oak is Quercus emorii. So the species code in this case is QUEM, like that. These species codes are available, and some data sheets even come populated with them to make it easier to add those to the list. If you don't know the species code, you can just write the common name or the species name, and we can go back and add that information later. Tree count, I'm not exactly sure what that is, and it's not important for our particular purposes. The DRC number of stems, that's where we're going to want to write how many stems there were in total. In this case, there were 3. This is the DRC column, so I'm just going to make up measurements for the different diameter at root collar measurements. So I just said it was 12.1, 4.2, 6.3. We have the height. Remember, this is the overall height of the tree that you took with the laser rangefinder. I'm just going to say it's 20.1 meters. The height to the crown was the measurement from the ground to the lowest branch on the tree. We'll call that 1.1 meters. And in general, try to measure things, of course, in the metric system with meters and centimeters. But if you have to make measurements in the English system, in the English standard system, just make sure you note that somewhere. So say I measured the DRC in inches, I would just make sure I noted that I was measuring that in inches. But in general, it's better to try to be consistent and stay within the metric system. We did this axis 1 and axis 2 refers to our canopy area measurements, where we were measuring the longest length of the canopy and the axis that was perpendicular to it. So I'm just going to say that that was 4.3 and 4.1 meters. Our acorn scans, our observer number 1 counted 10 acorns, observer number 2 counted 12 acorns. And now we get into this damage category, damage agent and damage severity columns. Here you can look down at the bottom of the data sheet. We have different damage categories, different damage agents, and kind of a description of how to write out the information about severity. But let's just start over here with the damage categories. We're interested in a couple of things. We're really interested in pests and pathogens that could be affecting these trees. And we're also interested in herbivory or browse by different types of animals, including cattle, deer, and elk. So the damage category is kind of a general category when you can't really identify what's wrong, but you suspect it's a fungal pathogen or a boring insect. So fungal pathogens will often have like a powdery, mushroomy look kind of on the outside of the bark. And boring insects, of course, would look like there are holes going into the tree. So if that's all, the more you can identify them. We have these codes down at the bottom. So pretend I saw a boring insect. I would list that as damage category 15. You can have multiple damage categories if multiple things are affecting the tree. Then the damage agent is when you can really hone in and for some reason you're able to identify what is causing the damage you noted in this previous category. So pretend that I am someone who knows a lot about pests and pathogens, and I could say, okay, this boring insect, it was a golden spotted oak borer. Then I can use this code over here to indicate that I had seen a golden spotted oak borer. You might not ever, there are going to be occasions where you can see damage, but you do not know what's causing it, and it's hard for you to ascertain what the damage agent is. That is totally fine. Just note the damage. You could even make some kind of note about what it looks like or what you suspect, and then we can send somebody out that is a plant pathologist, or perhaps me if I get a little bit more training in these pest and pathogen identifications, and we can come back through, and when we see a lot of damage, we can come back and try to make those decisions about what is causing the damage afterwards. But the important thing is you're kind of making some kind of notes on any major damage you're seeing on these oaks. The final category is this damage severity category, and this is really pretty subjective. You're looking at the tree as a whole and you're trying to say how much of the tree is damaged. Now in this case, I'm going to note independently that this one whole stem is dead. So I'll make some kind of note over here. One stem is dead. And then I'm going to look at the tree as a whole and I'm going to say, okay, well, 1/3 of the tree is completely gone, so 1/3 is damaged. And then there's a little bit more damage on this other stem. So I'm just going to guess and say 37% of the crown is damaged. Because that is very subjective, it's often nice to have another person look at the tree and just throw out a quick, I think it's 50% affected. And then you can kind of take the mean of your two guesses, because it is something that's a bit subjective. So the more people you kind of have informing that, the closer you can get to a pretty good number. So this is basically how you fill out these data sheets. Of course, you're going to want to put what overall plot number you're referring to. You're going to want to write the name of the site, the date that you're collecting the data, and of course anyone's names that are helping you out here in the field. So this is the general structure of how you're going to fill out these data sheets. And the one important thing you want to remember is just that the only column that's going to be repeated besides this ID column, which is just keeping you honest, is this DRC column.